No,
Yeah.
okay.
Start again.
It's okay.
You can please continue. It's fine.
I'm not gonna start again. I couldn't do that over again. Okay, so I know that all of you in the room and probably many of those online are already familiar with kind of the debate around the female labor force participation rates in India, but I wanted to start a bit broad and actually contextualize this, right? And when we actually look at the trends globally, we see something very similar and very striking, which is that female labor force participation rates actually have been declining globally and have gone down by about 5 percentage points since the beginning of the 21st century, right? And of course, the lack of parity between female labor force participation and male labor force participation is very pronounced and consistent, and we haven't been terribly successful in narrowing those gaps, despite, and I'll keep coming back to this point over and over, despite the number of actors, I don't want to call it lip service because it is backed up to some extent with programs and funding as well to try to narrow these gaps and these disparities. We actually see that female labor force participation rates have been declining. And it's not just a phenomenon necessarily in the global South. There's also something going on in the global North, although my work focuses much more on the global South, but it's worth pointing out that in 2008, 2009, when the financial crisis happened in the United States, for the first time ever, right, the number of households that had a female breadwinner actually exceeded the number of households where there were male breadwinners, right? But now with COVID and the impact of COVID, that phenomenon has been completely wiped out, and even countries like the United States have seen a significant decline in their female labor force participation rates over the last couple of years. That said, when we look at the breakdown of okay, now this is not moving. No, the slides are not. Thank you. So I just have to tap the. Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we look at the female labor force participation rates by country income grouping, we do actually see that this global phenomenon is still being driven by the middle income countries, right? And this lends itself to the story that we've all heard about, the fact that, oops, sorry, I'm really struggling with this. Maybe, okay, there we go. And this really, fits in with this idea that female labor force participation, women's participation in the labor market follows this kind of U-shaped distribution. If we think broadly, there's 3 categories of women, right? One is sort of the lower educated and lower skilled women. And therefore, we find that women are often overrepresented in agricultural employment. And this is true globally. It's very true. That's why female labor force participation rates are so high in many countries in Africa. And then we see kind of the middle educated and skilled women, where we see a massive dip in participation. And then on the top end, we see the higher educated, higher skilled women that are, also aligned with sort of urban women that have, again, higher participation rates. Now, this is important, and I know you all know this already, but this is important because it's interesting to imagine that as there is a change from agriculture to services, for example, what people like to call structural transformation. I don't call it that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But as there's this, what people call structural transformation out of low productivity sectors like agriculture into, for example, services, that we might actually see the female labor force participation rise. Now, you might ask, why don't I call it a structural transformation? Because ultimately, I think that female labor force participation and how we assess the position of women and their contributions to the economy has to go beyond just a participation number, right? And that you might say that there's a lot of people that move out of agriculture into services, but services itself is a very heterogeneous sector. If all the women, and I'm exaggerating here just to make a point, if all the women from agriculture end up going into domestic work in the service sector, is that a structural transformation, right? And you might still see in the service sector, aggregate productivity has gone up, right? And employment has gone up, right? And you might even see that per worker productivity, if you look at it in aggregate terms, has gone up, right? But ultimately, why that could be and is, which is my argument, is completely driven by, again, the very top segment, which is tech-driven, highly educated. And if you have a majority of your women going from agriculture, low productivity work into low productivity work and services, from agriculture to services, is that really a structural transformation, right? And this kind of background is really important, because when you really hone immediately into the gig economy and what it means, which is what I'll spend the rest of the time doing, you have to keep in mind this broader picture, because the gig economy offers certain benefits and certain disadvantages, but overall, what are we looking at here, right? Is it truly offering better opportunities for women or not? And this kind of broad picture of what it means to actually transform your economy and what it actually means to transform women's experiences and empowerment in the labor market goes well beyond these kind of aggregate numbers of labor force participation. Right. So, of course, when we look at it in the context of India, we all know that female labor force participation is low and parity is lacking. It was declining for a very long time, but now we're actually seeing this kind of uptick in female labor force participation. And India ranks 135 on the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index, below Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, right? Which is quite striking. So for all our talk about being a country that has seen massive improvements in female enrollment in education and parity in higher education, and and sort of the emerging market economy status of our country, I think it's quite paradoxical that our women are still in such a low kind of participation, that their participation is so low. And the reason I gave you all this background is because we are seeing female labor force participation rise. But what kinds of jobs are these women getting into? And is it really going to end up narrowing this kind of gap that we see in terms of women's work, their experience of work, and the parity with men? So broadly speaking, just to kind of wrap this broad contextual side of things with a neat little bow, there's supply side factors and there's demand side factors that contribute to not just women's labor force participation, but also their kind of experience in the world of work. And on the supply side, we know that some of the drop could be attributed to what is actually a positive thing, of women staying in education longer. But on the other hand, there's also things like a lack of access to potentially technology, right? Fewer than 1 in 5 women actually use mobile internet. Fewer than 1 in 4 actually have a smartphone. And even that is questionable, because sometimes they say they have a smartphone, but actually it's their sons or their husbands or their brothers that are using it. We know that there's a skills gap. Also, just broadly, enrollment does not equal attendance, does not equal quality, right? And then social security. So, are we really providing the kinds of benefits, and I'm trying to move away from saying benefits to entitlements. Are we providing the kinds of entitlements that women really need, and a broader supportive infrastructure, right? So I was, just a side anecdote, I'm part of a UN Women expert group that feeds into the CSW 67, this global forum for looking at women's participation. And this year they're looking at digital. And one of the women that was kind of leading this group is someone who's worked for many years in the tech sector. And she said something really striking. She said, I've been working with companies like Oracle and Intel for most of my career, but I realized that I got where I got by acting like a man, right? Without the system actually changing to accommodate the fact that women make different contributions. Doesn't mean they can't make the same and better contributions as men, but we are different. And why should we have to be like men in order to be able to harness our productive potential? And this is important when we talk about what women need as a supportive infrastructure, right? This is not some kind of privilege that we are given. This is an entitlement in terms of our contributions, to our families, to childcare, and research supports this. If you give money to women, it leads to much higher benefits for families and children and so on in terms of their educational outcomes, et cetera, right? So what is the supportive infrastructure? It could range from obviously things like safe transport, the basics, right? Separate bathrooms in the workplace, to things like childcare, to recognition for our ASHA workers and Anganwadi workers as employers and as employees, and actually paying them even a minimum wage. I would argue for a much higher wage, right? A living wage. Nonetheless, I think those are important when we're talking about supply side factors holistically. And then there's demand side factors, which, someone said to me in jest, and this was, and I won't name the person, but needless to say, it was a man, and he was joking, he was clearly joking. But he said, oh, thank God women's labor force participation is so low. We don't even have jobs for our men, right? And he was joking, but I've actually heard people sort of say these kinds of things, right? And I think that these things are never quite so simple. Yes, women's contributions are multifaceted, right? I personally do think that mothers have a very important role to play. And so therefore, caregiving should not solely be the responsibility of the woman, but I also don't want to take that away from women and say, you have to be like a man and just be outside and have someone else raise your child, right? So the idea of the quantity of jobs for women has to also be balanced with the multitude of roles and the positive multiplier effects, even in economic terms, that women make in this broader context. So overall, the quantity of jobs, but also so there's an overall lack in India in terms of the number of jobs, but certainly when it comes to the jobs that are available to women and the quality of those jobs available for women, there's a huge dearth there. And then, of course, the employer propensity to hire women. So in a lot of our primary research with employers, and particularly small and medium employers, I mean, they are very explicit, right? Some will say to you, we don't want to hire women because we don't believe that they make the same level of contributions as men. And what that means could be competence. It could also mean number of hours that she can devote. It's, but we don't think she can make the same contributions. Two, we don't want the liability of having to pay for safe transport or deal with her safety at the workplace. Or put in effort to have separate bathrooms, or all of those factors that that employers will often cite that prevent women from being active. So despite decades of focus in acknowledging the importance and the benefits of women's economic contributions, we still see this large disparity and widening disparity worldwide, but and certainly in India, kind of consistent lack of parity, right? Second, women's participation in the labor market, their experience and outcomes are not, as I said, just not enough to just look at, are they in the labor market employed or looking for work, but also what is their broader experience in the world of work. In terms of broader social and political context. And this I'll come back to in my recommendations, because it's something I feel very strongly about, and it's substantiated by research. And I'll come back to this point, that we have to contextualize women's participation in a broader context, and which factors are most, which of these factors, so the demand and the supply side factors, we've heard so many academics and researchers do the work to see what are the factors that are driving this, right? But actually, none of us can say which factors are most salient when in a woman's trajectory, which geographies, because the fact is that it's a confluence of things, and you cannot cleanly ascribe it and say, oh, it's just the middle income effect, right? It could be the middle income effect, but it could also be that the middle income effect is itself a function of exploitation in the labor market, where if a family earns just slightly more and the man, they can make do with a man's income, the woman says, okay, I'll drop out because I really don't want to have to deal with hot weather, in unsafe transport, exploitation at work, and then a lack of parity in wages for the same work, right? A recent Oxfam report talks about the just the function of discrimination in determining women's labor force outcomes and participation. And it's really quite striking. I would urge you all to go and read it. But so these factors themselves, these underlying factors are very important in in determining a woman's experience in the labor market. And also the fact that because there are a multitude of factors, I, for one, am very skeptical of anyone that says it's this, right? It's many things. And this is important when I'll get to the recommendations, because what it points to is that we can't have single solutions. The solutions have to be architectural and systemic, right? There has to be systemic change if we truly want to see women's outcomes improve. So now I'll talk more deeply into the gig economy and platform economy specifically. But keep in mind this broad context, because how we assess women's work in the context of platforms is really also a function of everything else that I've just kind of laid out for you. So when we talk about digital platforms, there's this sort of emerging ecosystem of digital work now. And this creates opportunities for income generation in, for example, e-commerce, which on this sort of flowchart is the selling platforms. So, where women can make artisanal products and sell them online on, say, a marketplace like Amazon or Etsy. And there's a whole host of literature, conversation, discourse happening around how this is really enabling women to work from home and to actually realize some of their entrepreneurial talent, and that this is really a potential way of boosting women's labor force participation. Then there's also location-based work, which is our sort of transport, also looking at home care, personal services, and here we see a very gendered kind of distribution in terms of which of these subsectors women are involved in. I'll say it, we all know it, much less in delivery, transport, etc., much more in household personal services. And then there's web-based work, which is microtasking and freelancing, which spans a large range of what we call skills, digital skills, cognitive skills, right? There's within this category of web-based work, there's a range of different kinds of women with different kinds of skills and education levels. And this kind of work, rather than location-based work, offers opportunities for working from home, which in fact, in our research, a lot of women say that they really appreciate the ability to balance income generation activities with their domestic responsibilities, and I'll talk more about that. And finally, a third very pronounced phenomenon in terms of the platform economy and the opportunities it's offering for women is the use of platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook, what's called social commerce. So women will go out and they'll buy wholesale products and they'll sell them through their networks on WhatsApp and Facebook, etc. So we have platforms that mediate this kind of work, like Meesho, for example, right? So this is kind of broadly a typology that my colleague Prerna Seth and I developed that kind of lays out the different kinds of income generation opportunities where you're using your own labor. So of course you can generate an income from a platform for Airbnb, right? But we're talking about where you're using your own agency and labor, and the different ways that that women's work interacts with this kind of evolving platform economy and ecosystem of digital work. Please, how much time do I have? You have I have half. Okay, so I can keep talking. Okay, so just a quick sip. So the question really is, how are women faring in this new sort of evolving ecosystem of digital work? And are there ways to leverage digital platforms to create high quality, gender inclusive work for women? And what must happen to enable women to avail opportunities to ensure better outcomes? And dare I say, minimize the costs, right? And these are really important questions, because invariably in a context of, our demographic bulge, where there's a large and growing youth population, there's not enough jobs against the backdrop of what has till late been a declining female labor force participation. Invariably, you will hear policymakers say that the gig economy is a great option because it allows women the flexibility to work from home, balance income generation with domestic work. They don't have to deal with a lot of things outside. Employers, the demand side issues don't matter. This kind of work is where the jobs are for women, right? And I think this is a deeply problematic position. If our best answer for women's employment and improving their labor force participation and outcomes is to say that the gig economy and the digital platform economy is the solution, this is highly problematic. And I would urge you all to kind of, for all of us to make this argument through our research and through our writing loud and clear, that women need to have options, and let's, for the sake of conversation, call it the real economy and not just the evolving digital and platform economy. And here's why. So what attracts women, so what kind of is attracting to women? What is attracting women into the platform economy? Now, for one, let me say, we're seeing slight rise in female labor force participation. I recently did a Work Life India BBC, I think yesterday or day before. It's all a blur. This week is all a blur. But I recently did a Work Life India segment looking at the fact that this Diwali season, there was an uptick in temporary employment for women, through staffing agency like Team Lease and others, right? And my co-panelist in that program was making the point that this is a great thing, because we've actually seen a lot of corporates recognizing the importance of diversity, and that there's a big difference between gig work and temporary work, because temporary work through staffing platforms like a Team Lease actually offers certain benefits, right? Whereas if you're in the gig economy, you're self-employed, and I'll talk more about that. But the idea that, women are, again, even in this context, being relegated to a poor quality work. And second, we don't actually know what the size of the gig economy is, or what the actual, how many women are actually employed in temporary forms of work versus kind of platform-based work. Forget about knowing how many women are actually employed in home-based work. The best we can do is like Oxford Internet Institute, their sort of scraping of data from the big 6 microtasking and freelancing platforms and saying, okay, this is potentially what we think it is. That said, we do know, for example, that India has it has about 8% of the world's platforms are actually originating out of India, which is just second to the United States. We also know that India has a very large share. I think it's about 1/4 or just under 1/4 of the global share of online labor force, right? So we know that there's something going on there where more and more women are participating in these forms of work. These forms of work need to be distinguished from sort of temporary forms of work, but these forms of work are also tied to, work in logistics, etc. That's sort of what we're seeing now in the holiday season. There's a slight uptick, and the extent to which women are kind of behind the scenes managing. They're not doing the delivery, but they're in the behind the scenes kind of management, and what kinds of opportunities are being created there. But we don't actually know the actual numbers or, so again, we know that there's a big invisibility of women in data because they're disproportionately represented in informal work, because they do like, care-based work is invisible, because, and now we're adding to that the fact that women are in increasing numbers getting into this digital ecosystem of work that is also going to promote this kind of invisibility in terms of anything beyond maybe the slight aggregate uptick in their labor force participation. Was that clear? I was a bit roundabout, but I hope my point got across. Yeah. And I think those distinctions are important, particularly the distinctions between temporary work and platform work is important to make. Right, because we do see changes in sort of the composition of employment in the labor market that is a result of these big staffing agencies, but that's temporary work. And so how sticky is it? Is that kind of trend going to stick? We don't know, probably not, right? It's a very small share. And on the other side, when it's this digital ecosystem of work, it's kind of a black hole. We don't actually know how many women or men, for that matter, are actually in platforms. Who has this information? Platforms do, right? But we don't have access to that kind of data. So women enter this kind of digital ecosystem of work often because of flexibility, because the idea of flexibility for them is very important. They get to balance home domestic work with income generation. But if you look at the dimension of flexibility in our conversations and interviews with women that are in the platform, there's a huge variation between location-based and online web-based digital work, right? Location-based work, by the time, let's say I'm a beautician, by the time I've caught an auto, fought traffic, carried my massage table or, equipment, etc., gotten somewhere and provided this, and maybe I have to wait, provided the service. I don't get to decide, and I'll get to that in the autonomy section, the income and the prices that I charge, etc. But that flexibility is actually deeply reduced, right? Whereas if I was actually working in a salon, I might be able to service 3, 4, 5, 6 clients. When I'm actually doing it on location, I think that I have a high degree of flexibility because I get to choose my gigs. But the reality is that by the end of the day, women are finding that they actually don't have that much flexibility because of all these other factors that contribute. Right? So the flexibility dimension itself is one big reason why women are getting it, and then realizing that it's not actually materializing. That's on location work. What about web-based work? Even with web-based work, the fact that they're now staying at home, but they have this additional sort of care burden and the expectation that because she's at home, she can take care of an increase in, domestic responsibilities. We actually find women consistently saying, I like the flexibility in sort of web-based work of being at home, but I have to constantly keep looking for gigs and I don't have that kind of time. And therefore, it doesn't actually lead to, the same kinds of employment outcomes that they might have had if they were outside. So this idea of flexibility and the idea of choice, right? Are women actually choosing this kind of work because it really is better, or because they already have such a high burden of domestic work and responsibilities that they don't have a choice, and so they're just trying to make things work to the best of their ability? I think those are really important questions to nuance this idea of flexibility. Autonomy. Again, especially with on location work, we find that the companies have a lot of expectations in terms of standards of service delivery, uniforms, the kinds of products that women can use, We've seen, we've heard stories about women that, are automatically sent products. So for example, I'll be very specific, a woman that does manicures, a professional that does manicures, most of the clients like to use their own nail polish, but the company will automatically send her nail polish and deduct it from her compensation without really asking her whether she even needs it, because, and so these kinds of detailed nuances actually make a big impact on when we talk about how much income does actually the woman end up with, how much autonomy does she actually have. And even when we're talking about web-based work, for example, the situation is the autonomy is deeply lacking again, because it's slightly more than location-based work, but it's still lacking because you again have to constantly keep searching for opportunities. There are particular guidelines that are provided by the platform. And through all of this, the platform is not ever considered to be your employer. And while they mediate how you provide your service to quite an extent, including setting of prices, you as a worker are considered a self-employed contractor, and therefore you enjoy absolutely no labor protections and no labor protections and no social security, right? So autonomy, maybe, but at the cost of what? And again, this needs to also be contextualized in a broader economy-wide trend for both men and women, where we are seeing a rise in self-employment, right? And that's, again, deeply disturbing because it's a sign of an overall growing precarity in the labor force, in which women will be worst affected, right? Everybody is being affected, all workers are being affected, but women also get the short end of the stick, as we saw with plenty of research during COVID. Income, I already talked about a little bit. In terms of entitlements, again, I've kind of talked about it, the fact that you're going from being a regular wage worker potentially to being a self-employed worker. You're not getting the same entitlements, and this becomes particularly difficult for women that then don't have maternity leave and so on. Now, you may ask, well, you're making the assumption that we're moving from regular wage work into this kind of self-employment. This also then speaks to the issue of we don't know, right? We are actually finding evidence of both. We are actually finding evidence of women, particularly in the web-based work that's higher skilled, that women are sometimes leaving actual careers and companies and moving to this kind of work, which is definitely more precarious. There's no other way to put it. And maybe for some women, they're coming from not doing anything into this, but then it's also not clear how long they'll stay in this. And most of the women that we've spoken to actually say that this is a temporary stopgap, that this kind of platform work is a temporary thing for us. If you're more educated, then you think, and skilled in quotation marks, then you think, what's my next career move and how long am I going to do this for? And most of them are really thinking about it in temporary terms. If you're in location-based work, it's similar. Like what's my next move? Particularly because location-based work is actually proving to be really much more difficult, right? Than they had expected. So it's not just always a relative comparison of like, oh, they were doing nothing before and now they're doing something, so that's better, because it won't stick. The quality of work is so bad. And this, again, I want to tie it to what I was saying about the middle income effect, right? You might say, oh, these families are better off and therefore these women are not working. They're actually dropping out potentially. We don't actually have the incidents, but they're actually, many of them, I think it's a warranted conclusion to draw that many of them are also dropping out because the actual participation in the labor force itself is so fraught with so many challenges that the minute you can drop out, you do. And the same thing applies to the gig economy in the sense that the work itself, when it doesn't deliver on better outcomes, particularly on the dimensions that you thought it would, flexibility, autonomy, income, when it doesn't deliver, how long do we think this phenomenon is going to last? I have my fingers crossed, not very long, hopefully. And then the final thing I'll just say is a word about representation, which is the idea that you know, if we sort of look at aside from agriculture, you know, in factories and manufacturing, sort of textile sector, etc., where you have some ability to collectivize, although we all know that women are underrepresented in unions, right? And that women, and yet in this country, I think we have one of the best examples of self-help groups and so on, where women do collectivize. But through the platform economy, those opportunities to collectivize, which are very much driven by physical proximity, are actually taken away from you. So what does that mean in terms of the power dynamic, in terms of parity, in terms of your own position in the workplace is a big question. Some women have been very resourceful and, you know, have started WhatsApp groups and so on, but there's also very explicit evidence that companies have actually broken up those groups or prohibited them or found out and blocked them from the platform and so on, right? So the idea of representation, particularly in a 21st century economy that is increasingly becoming self-employed, digital, I think these questions become even more pronounced. And one of the major takeaways from all of this conversation is the idea that in some ways, as work is becoming more digitized, both on platforms and in other ways, we are again replicating the same offline biases online, and in many cases, even exacerbating them further, right? So if we are actually worried about women's labor force participation and beyond that, women's experience in the labor market and their unequal outcomes, I think we're looking at a very dangerous future, because these things are only going to get worse in that respect. The aggregate trends of structural transformation notwithstanding, if you're taking women from low productivity jobs in agriculture and shoving them into horrible jobs in service sector, that doesn't signify any kind of an improvement. Sorry. So just to kind of start wrapping up and talk about a few recommendations. So I mentioned the lack of data and the invisibility of women in data, and I cannot emphasize, and we all know how important this is, right? When it comes to particularly platforms, we know that platforms have a lot of this data, but there's no regulation that actually mandates them to share it. And so potentially some kind of data sharing agreements could be very useful in this space that would allow us to get information on the incidence, characteristics, and experience of women engaging in digitally mediated work. And if there's sort of data sharing and transparency with companies and platforms that share this data, that's one concrete thing that we could do to have a better understanding of women's work in this unfolding ecosystem of digital work. That said, and I know this, to me, this is not said nearly enough, because how many times have we all been in rooms where people have said, if you can't measure it, it doesn't count, right? It will be years before women become visible in this kind of data. For one, technological trends are moving much faster than the ability of institutions to keep up, right? And by institutions, I mean government regulation. I mean, when do you really think platforms are going to be, we're going to have regulation in place that will make platforms share their data? I think platforms will be long gone by the time that happens, right? By the time we come around to actually getting the regulations we need, who knows what the state of the world will be. Maybe climate change, I don't know. Second, even if we had the data, it's always lagging, particularly labor market data, right? And third, and this is really important. So one is when it comes to the invisibility of women in data, please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't lobby for more and better data and measurement of women's labor force participation and the details of their work experience and so on. We absolutely need this data. We need to continue to lobby for regulations, but we cannot in the meantime use that as an excuse to not address factors that we know need addressing. That's the reality. And I don't care if someone says to me, oh, how can you say that it's not data driven? Data driven is important, but it's not the be all and end all. And for one thing, socioeconomic factors that are key and underlying to what affects women's experience and their participation are not, are in and of themselves not conducive to the same kinds of measurement and metrics, right? And this is something that I think we all can really push for, because again, the focus on women's economic contributions and how empowering them economically will lead to will be a solution to this parity problem. We are seeing it. This is why I gave you the example of the United States, right? The fact that the change happened, but then it fell right back is in an economy that we may or may not, I don't want to get into too much of a discussion. It's certainly maybe not as patriarchal as India is, right? It has its issues. But the point there being that there are underlying socioeconomic, sociocultural factors, social normative factors that unless we actually are brave enough to address them and to say that those need to be addressed through programming, we're not actually going to see the kind of progress we'd like to see. And this is globally and certainly in the context of India, right? So, you know, when a lot of the work in this area of gender, a lot of it comes from multilateral frameworks, right? SDGs, UN Women, all of this. And those are all international multilateral forums that really are afraid to tell countries that they need to look at their patriarchal norms, right? I understand, I've worked in these systems. I understand the reluctance to do so, but there are ways to do it in a way that says, okay, you should look at your own structures within the context of it, but they don't even want to go that far. And so when we buy into the SDG structure of doing things, or we buy into the UN Women structure of doing things without actually saying to them, listen, you need to tell all of our governments that they need to actually look at the range of policies through this lens of socio-cultural patriarchy, I think that's extremely important. And, you know, it's a very hard battle to fight because they resist it all the time, right? But unless we actually get to these kinds of issues, we all know women in training, they don't go because they can't leave their house. If they do leave their house, everything that I've already talked about, discrimination from the employer, unsafe transport, you know, all of these factors kick in. And again, I'll point you to the Oxfam report that talks about the discrimination against women as being a very large factor in determining their employment participation and economic participation and employment outcomes. So unless we're actually willing to address the root cause, we might see incremental progress looking at sort of the economic issues, but we really are putting the cart before the horse, and this trajectory will just take that much longer unless we're brave enough to actually fight for what we need to actually look at. And the third recommendation is this is kind of my catch-all. So it's not actually one recommendation, it's many specific recommendations, which is the broader ecosystem and architecture of support. So number one, we all look at gender sensitization in specific policies, right? Let's look at maternity policies. Let's look at sort of whether we want to allow companies to keep women after 8 p.m. or not. We look at very specific, like childcare and so on. All of those are extremely important. And as this slide suggests, we need to address all of these different issues. But that's not enough, because there is this architectural systemic bias against women that is either rooted in sort of political participation, which also needs to be improved, sociocultural norms, which we're scared to address, and the fact that our economic systems are designed in ways that are not necessarily structured to promote more and productive work for women. If you take the construction sector, how much money are we spending in our last budget? What was our allocation for construction? Construction is a highly gender regressive sector. So what are we doing either to improve they employ women's opportunities in construction and improve the outcomes for them, or offsetting that with investments in healthcare and education and other sort of female-friendly sectors that also make huge economic contributions to our overall GDP and so on, and well-being of our societies. Right, so we need to broaden kind of our scope of looking at our entire economic system, our budgets, our policy frameworks through a gender lens, and not just honing in on gender sensitization in one specific area. We obviously need to address things like safety and transport work, and at home, online, offline, gender-based violence, all of those factors that you all are very familiar with. We need to make efforts to reduce time poverty, which also affect women's participation online and in this digital ecosystem of work. So childcare, water, access, electricity, etc. We need to enable better education and skills. Again, not just stop at enrollment, but actually look at much beyond that, and also moving past gender normative occupations. And enable access to social security, which I've already talked about, and promote political participation and leadership, which I've also already talked about. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sabina. That was fantastic, and that was really something that we wanted to. We already have some questions. No, that these was things that we really wanted to hear, and because there's overexcitement around the platforms for women being able to, in a sense that it is actually being taken as the panacea for short-term panacea for solving the problems of women's labor force participation, at least in India, that, okay, a lot of women can join the gig and the platform work, and actually we can really improve labor force participation. And I'm so glad that you actually pulled out all the nuances of what it actually takes for a woman to shift from a real into the virtual fold of work. So that's really, really, I mean, as much as I admire your work, and as much as I admire all the positions that you take, because at least I agree with it so much, today was fantastic. So I would not really ask you a question. I would rather see who all have questions here, and also requesting online, the online audience to post your questions on the chat box. We already have 2. So I think there's a comment and there's a question. Is there anyone else who has access to the host apart from that?
I think now we can, since the sharing is done, we'll just monitor the chat. That would be great.
So maybe you can read out one of the questions. I think one was a very clarificatory question, and there was the first one. Whoever asked the first question, could you ask what exactly was it? I think it came in between the.
It was in response.
Yeah, in response to a particular slide. Could you please unmute and ask the question?
Yeah, sure. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi. Sure. My name is Pooja. I'm working as an RA in ISB. And I was just interested in the flowchart that you had made of digital services that comes from the gig economy and Amazon and all of those things. If there's any, I understand that comes from probably a more urban setting rather than a rural context. And if there's, I'm sure maybe there's nothing in terms of digital ecosystem that could make a similar flowchart, but if there's something we can start thinking about in terms of rural areas as well, as to how to make a flowchart like that, which looks at employment in the current state of affairs.
You mean digital in rural, and then a similar kind of flowchart, is it?
Yeah, something like that. But I'm sure like the digital ecosystem in the rural areas are not that strong.
Yeah.
So then we'd probably have to address it in a different way.
But I do think that this is a very interesting question, and here's why. Because particularly when it comes to e-commerce, at least in the imagination of our policymakers, this is providing opportunities to rural women that are making, different kinds of products and selling them in marketplaces, right? But if you actually speak to these big online marketplaces, they will tell you that those are not the kinds of women that are actually, so I have so let me finish that thought. To answer your question, I think number one, I think you're absolutely right. And it's important to point out that that these are not available, even the e-commerce platforms, let alone the gig work platforms, but the e-commerce platforms in our policymakers' imagination are providing opportunities for entrepreneurship in rural areas, which is not a substantiated assumption. Certainly reality does not substantiate that. You hear from various e-commerce platforms saying that actually the women that are using these platforms have a certain degree of digital literacy, have an understanding of how to make their products stand out, even in urban areas. And this is the story I was going to tell you. I have a really good friend, childhood friend, who recently wanted to start a baby product line and posted and put it on Amazon and Etsy India. And she calls me up, and this is an educated woman saying, I have no idea how to stand out from the number, but right, the idea of shop optimization, I started to look more into that. Even for an urban literate woman to do things like shop optimization, take the right photos, to market yourself so that your products stand out is very difficult. So the actual reality of what's happening in terms of participation from rural women on these platforms is very low. That said, Seva Bharat, for example, is doing a lot of very interesting work in terms of women cooperatives that are using platforms like ONDC, which is a open kind of platform, to take their products, and particularly agricultural products, and place them in this marketplace. So it's interesting because that is the only context in which I'm seeing some movement in rural, but it's a big question about whether, I mean, we can have a whole other discussion about ONDC, but whether that even survives, or will big behemoth e-commerce platforms ultimately wipe that out as well? We don't know. And then does it, again, is there this kind of consolidation happening with only the big players, right? And you hear e-commerce platforms say this all the time, invariably, across e-commerce platforms. There's maybe 60 or 80 sellers that actually get good business, because there's so many of them.
Yeah, true. Thanks, Sabina. There was a second. Anybody from here who wants to ask a question?
I have a question.
Okay, maybe we'll take this and then we'll go to the online one.
So I'm Priyanka, I'm a senior associate at ID Insight, and my question is maybe on the cultural barriers that you mentioned in your recommendations.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you worked on like what role does household autonomy play on female labor force participation, and if not, if there are any resources that you would suggest, because like even on those household roles that are there, women actually want to take up those roles, they want to work. That sort of autonomy, how does that play into it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question. And how do you define autonomy? It also goes to this element of choice. If you see it worldwide, even in East Asia, Southeast Asia, research shows that women themselves say they want to work at home, right? But then again, is that really a choice, or is it because they're right? So the idea of autonomy and choice, I think, are really closely connected. There is research that looks at this issue more sociology based and research, which I would be happy to point you to after this conversation. But I think that's a really important question, and our work touches on it insofar as we look at sort of broadly empowerment frameworks, we all know Naila Kabir's empowerment framework, and how some of these gig work attributes fit into that. And that kind of touches on this idea of autonomy. But there's other research that talks about social cultural norms and the impact that that has on labor force participation more broadly, which I can point you to afterwards.
That would be great. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Shruti.
Should we, I can do last, let's go with this.
It's okay.
Okay, so I just wanted to understand that globally, in the research work that you've done, have you found any sort of meaningful attempt to address the issue of gender-based violence? Because at workplace, at like platform or gig work, because even in the formal sector, this is something that we haven't been able to address significantly. So has there been any real attempt, especially in the West, which has propped up gig work, which has why we think that's the way to go? So have you seen any real attempt?
So gender-based violence more broadly or specifically
At the work,
at the workplace?
in the gig work context.
So in the gig work context, not, right? Because again, what are the ways that you would address it? In terms of location-based, the only, and this is a really important question. I'm really glad you asked it, because it speaks to redressal mechanisms that are completely absent when there's no employer as such, right? If I'm self-employed and I get subject to gender-based violence or sexual exploitation at a customer's house, the platforms have no responsibility. And so, you know, it's very hard unless we change the legal definitions of the platform's role to actually be able to address them. And I think while there's a lot of conversation about this, there isn't any kind of specific way that legally that I'm aware of that this is being addressed. Again, in the context of web-based work and violence of a different kind, but you know, it becomes very hard to actually hold platforms accountable, even more so because they're in another country. Right, so so these issues are being looked at, and in some countries, for example, I think that Germany, for example, and some other European countries are really looking at trying to define the roles of platforms, not quite calling them employers, but still holding them accountable for certain, not necessarily entitlements, but at least certain kinds of protections in this respect.
Fantastic. I see a question on the chat box. Could you ask your question? Actually, two. The one on continuous policing of women's movement and women's body. Okay, that was a thank you. So, someone who asked this question, could you unmute and speak?
So I'm really curious about who's on that.
Yeah, we'll share the details with you. How many people we have already had. I think the person who asked the question may have left the conversation. So, but just for the sake of others, would you want to take this, Sabina?
Sure, just read it. Yeah, I mean that, yeah. I think it's more of a comment than a question in some ways. I absolutely agree. So I don't know if you all are familiar with Donella Meadows, and it's a bit of a tangent, but Donella Meadows' pyramid for systems change. It's a pyramid that, like the top of the pyramid talks about things that are visible, right? Like, so the data trends, declining female labor force participation. The second tier talks about patterns. So how long have these trends persisted? The third talks about, I forget exactly what the term is, like the institutions. So, you know, what are government policies and regulations? What are potential social constructs? And the third, which is the base of the pyramid, talks about mindset, right? And in some ways, it goes from what are the longest term interventions, but potentially the most effective, if we can get at mindset, if we can get at and institutions, and then start looking at patterns and trends and how to change them, then we'll actually get at a much deeper level of change. And also in some ways from the most visible to the invisible, right? And so to this point, I think donors, governments, because of political cycles especially, tend to focus on the trends and patterns, not really on institutional change and certainly not on mindsets. But if we actually want to see real, lasting, sustainable change, then it needs to be at the base of this pyramid. And it needs to be a much longer term intervention. So I absolutely agree with this. And I think, if we are in this fight, it needs to be a long-term fight. It can't be tinkering on the, otherwise let's accept we're just tinkering on the edges. Aaj temporary employment kar diya, great, holiday season, Diwali, more women are in the labor force. And then 3 months later, 5 months later, we'll see what happens, right?
Yes.
Can I ask?
Yes, please.
So I was, when we're talking about, the invisible within the workforce, and of course, women are, there's requirement to have them clearly come out in the data and all, but they are also, I mean, women are, it's a heterogeneous population. And so when we talk about, say, women with disabilities, because that's an interest area for me, what are the trends or the patterns you see about, what is the areas that they work in, their concentration, what are the avenues you see for employment for different kinds of disabilities? Then there's, of course, the caste and the class angle within disability. So what are your reflections on that?
I mean, that's a really great and important area. And I will be very honest, I have not looked very specifically at that category of women. So I'm being completely honest, and it's an area that I've actually been very interested in looking at myself, but have not done as of yet. So I certainly, out of respect to your question and this area of work, I won't comment on something I really don't know enough about. So I'll accept it. It's mea culpa.
Yes. So hi, I'm Shruti. I'm from Center for Budget and Governance Accountability. Thanks, Sabina, for the talk. I found it really useful. So I just thought of, one more overarching constraint I feel is there, which gets in the way of creating the ecosystem that we were talking about. So as we are seeing this, increase in self-employment, and there's definitely a policy push towards self-employment. It's also been accompanied by a shift towards, cash delivery, DBTs, and credit and insurance, and basically financial products, sometimes at the cost of in-kind protections or in-kind services or physical infrastructure. So, something like, for example, creches, we've seen this, we're not investing enough in that area, or larger areas like health and education. So I'm just curious, do you see this as a, what are your thoughts on this, and to what extent do you think this is a barrier in the way of actually creating good, decent work for women?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way that you put it, because we talk about all of these things in segments. We talk about financial inclusion and the lack of it in segments. We talk about sort of creating entrepreneurs because there's not enough jobs, or somehow that's supposed to be more empowering. I'm not sure. And that's a whole other discussion. But so I think that your kind of phrasing of all of these factors together is really important, because there is, and what I think it points to, just what is as aggressive, I find that quite disturbing, is what is the role of government and state in actually taking care of workers, right? And when we say that we're promoting entrepreneurship, we're actually saying, fend for yourself and let's not create enough jobs. That's what I hear, right? When we're saying, let's give you cash transfers, UBI, right? Universal basic income, let's give people money and let's not provide them with benefits. And there's many examples in ways that this kind of mentality is manifesting, right? And I personally find it very scary, because I think that the whole role of the state, particularly in a situation where you have caste dimensions and other forms of vulnerability that create deep inequities, disabled women, or that create, and the gender inequities create, and again, also to your point, gender is itself more than just the binary, right?
Yeah.
So transgender and so on. So, in this very heterogeneous society and economy, the idea that the state has no role to play or is divesting increasingly of its role through cash transfers, through entrepreneurship and no need to create jobs, through increasing privatization, I think it begs a broader question about, do we really want more equitable economies and societies, right? So I think in the way that you've asked that question, I hope that I've kind of at least responded, if not answered. I'm not sure what your question was, but
Yeah, it seems to be, yeah, your perspective, yeah.
Anybody else have a question? Can I take the liberty of asking one? Yeah, so Sabina, I was just thinking that, when you talked about your, all the constraints, all the factors that seem attractive, but are actually the ones that pull out all the adverse impact on, women joining the digital workforce. I think some things that I'm sure you are completely aware of it. One is because the support that is needed to carry those daily things. And most of the times if we see women are actually depending on husbands or brothers or fathers for the commute, and that kind of family support is also very important for them to keep moving. And in addition, so basically it's all about mobility. That doesn't come easily for women. And that is, of course, part of what you were saying. But my question is different. This is just a aside, but my question is that when we talk about, there's also this whole thing about the policymakers talking a lot about platforms generating jobs for both men and women. How's it going to pan out for men? Because there are certain things that make this sector attractive for women, because there's apparently flexibility of time, autonomy of overtime use, and all this stuff that we were talking about. But for men, also, this is actually being looked upon as a sector that, as a space that's going to really absorb a lot of men, because we have these service deliveries, we have so much. How do you look at it? I want to know your thoughts on that. What's the difference between men and women taking up this? What's the difference?
So I think that's a really important question, and anyone that's heard me speak about digital knows my line, which is platforms are not really creating jobs. They're taking jobs and breaking them up into tasks and spreading it out among more people, right? So that's a little bit sensationalized, because in some sense, certainly when we're talking about work that is in the ICT sector and some of these jobs that are more regular wage jobs, there are certain new jobs that technology and platforms themselves, right? Platform companies themselves will hire workers that are full-time regular wage workers to create the algorithms and so on, right? So there are new jobs being created, but if we're talking about actually the self-employment that's being generated, then that's not really employment, it's gigs, it's tasks, it's not a job. So the idea that, that people say platforms, this kind of work is creating jobs, is something in and of itself I question deeply. What we are actually saying is that particularly as the incidence of this kind of work grows for men and so on, at some point, what you're saying is, look, demand is going to be finite. It might change at different points, and Diwali, the demand goes up, but demand is finite. And when the economy is not creating other regular wage jobs, and gig work, particularly location-based gig work, is relatively low-skilled work, you're going to see a massive influx, which is what we're seeing. We're seeing the number of Swiggy drivers, Amazon delivery boys, Zomato, etc., right? Not all of them are getting Zepto, not all of them are getting work or getting gigs. They go and stand there for hours waiting right? So the supply of labor and the visible sign that we see of all these drivers doesn't actually mean that the demand has necessarily, gone up. It's in the platform's interest to take as much labor in case at a particular time someone has a craving for chocolate ice cream and Zepto will deliver it, right? Or like, and so for the platform, it's like, okay, I get this labor, I get it cheap. There's a lot of it. If I don't like the way someone performs, I just block them from the platform. Why not? Right? So you have an oversupply of labor. That doesn't mean that you have demand that is accommodating all the labor. That also means that the oversupply of labor is pushing down wages and working conditions. Because if I don't like this guy, I can just block them from the platform and take that guy. So to your point, so now I think one is that this kind of, whether it's e-commerce based gig work based self-employment, or whether it's e-commerce based entrepreneurship or social commerce, all of these, whether it's for men or women, I think we have to first question the very notion that these are jobs. These are not jobs, they're gigs, right? And second, the very visible sign of it in the absence of numbers is the fact that, oh, so many people are doing it. That doesn't mean they're actually productively deployed, because we don't actually know what the demand is. We don't have that data, right? And the third thing is that where we see kind of an uptick, which is interesting again, and is this area of staffing companies like, I mean, it's the one that keeps coming to my mind because I work with them. I'm not singling them out, but Teamlease, for example. But again, those are temporary jobs, right? So they might be now supplying workers to like logistics companies and so on. And then you say, oh, that's great, because Teamlease will provide benefits, etc. But let's not forget that these are still temporary jobs. So they may not be gigs, but they're still temporary jobs.
Right.
They're not the solution to the employment challenge.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I see one more question from Sakshi.
Sakshi, hi Sakshi.
So Sakshi, you may unmute and speak, please. She's there. You have to unmute her.
Sakshi, we can't hear
We
you.
can't hear you, Sakshi.
I think that is because there is an issue.
Visible. She's muted. Sakshi is muted. Ask to unmute.
I can also see her question in case she's listening. Then I thought she
Otherwise, you can type out your question. Yeah, Sakshi.
Yeah. Hi Sakshi.
Yeah, I think it might.
Your
You want to type out your question?
She can hear us.
Yes, please. Come in with your question. Sakshi, you can type in. We're not able to hear you, so maybe you can type your question. Thanks so much for joining. Sakshi's from Niti Aayog.
Yes,
She's the
we work with her.
author, I'm sure. She's the author of the recent
report.
platform economy report.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, Sakshi.
Yeah.
Anybody else? You do?
So with the popularity in the economy recently and the rise of even women taking it up, even temporarily, however dismal or the quality of these jobs might or tasks might be, could it be a factor like to reduce the gender-wide gaps that exist in accessing technology because more women are undertaking these jobs now, or maybe access to that infrastructure might increase just because these temporary jobs require that infrastructure for them to reach them? Do you think?
So it's a good question. It's an interesting question. I think the reality is that tech penetration is going up among women anyway. I'm not sure to what extent this particularly will be a factor. I think you might, I mean, I'm not sure that that alone will be a major propelling factor, particularly as we see the realities of this kind of work emerge more clearly. I'm not sure it'll be as attractive to women, and therefore, but I still think that tech penetration will continue to go up. If you take cell phones and you look at the use, it's still a very small percentage that actually use it for work, right? Most people that are getting cell phones are getting it for other reasons, particularly for communication and entertainment, right? The rise in cell phones, dare I say, I mean, when you just hear anecdotal, but actually this is also substantiated by mobile use data, that it's much more used for entertainment than for work. So maybe some of it might be, but I imagine it'll be quite small. That said, I think we'll continue to see a rise in female adoption of technology, but I think the driving factors are more pronounced. Factors will be, desire to communicate, desire for entertainment, gaane sunne, things like that, which you see quite frequently. Yes.
Because you also mentioned a little bit about there being very, very low tech penetration in rural areas, specifically with respect to how much women use technology. I'm wondering if, and because we do see more and more that there's a push for digital work or even hybrid work, for example, to be taken to tier 2 cities, work from anywhere center being put out. Just given what we know in terms of data analytics, do we see that is going to be a possibility? And of course, the nature of work may be different in rural areas, but just technological abilities. Do we see that having some kind of uptake and like real benefits for women in a rural context, or do we still see that as not a possibility? It's been fairly urban of a process.
So my own sense is that for that question, we have to look at kind of the distribution of women's work in rural areas, which is still disproportionately high in agriculture, right? Now, the kind of hybrid work or digitally mediated work through, in any kind of meaningful way is not going to appeal to or is not going to be relevant to necessarily a woman that's in agriculture, unless we're talking about, again, ONDC type platforms and so on, right? So it really depends on what exactly we're talking about. That said, I do think that there's, you can't deny that there's a growing group of young women that are more educated than ever before, that are quite precocious and have aspirations to do more. And they're in tier 2 cities. Some of that might, digital kind of work. Like, so there's examples, for example, of e-merit in Kolkata, not rural, but that they are capitalizing on that kind of demographic, right? And you might see some of that in sort of tier 2 or urbanizing cities, but it'll be small and it'll be a while. If we're talking at this, scale wise, is based on my understanding of the data and the sort of distribution of women's work in rural versus urban.
And do you also think that there may be a risk of replicating the non-traditional gender biases in like traditional labor markets? Right? Because, for example, with the AI training, we were just talking about it this morning. Like entire workforce is just being, they're gathered in one place and they just train the AI the entire day. Digital work technically, but
absolutely. Women are still relegated to the low. I mean, there's someone recently I did a talk and someone asked me an interesting question, that does technology become an equalizer? Because especially in web-based work, right? Where if I want, let's say, micro tagging, right? Does it matter to me whether it's a man or a woman? Probably not. So does that now, and I get paid the same. So is that becoming an equalizer, which I thought was actually a very relevant and interesting question. Are there very specific instances where I think the blindness of things might lead to certain equalization? Potentially, but overall, I think technology itself is not an equalizer. And in many ways, online and digitally mediated work is really replicating the offline biases of, gendered kind of work. And by virtue of being gendered, there's no way for me to compare the prices that someone is getting paid for a manicure with a man that's a plumber or a carpenter, right? Like, it's not the same kind of work. But then also, I didn't talk much about algorithms, but the way that algorithms are written and interpreted, what does it mean for job platforms in terms of whose CVs are being put forward, what kind, all of those things ultimately lend themselves to the people at the back, which are people, right? I mean, so it's still the same, it's still people with the same kinds of biases that are writing the algorithms, that are analyzing what the algorithms are telling you, that are the way that women or service provider that comes to your house is being treated. Online web-based work is slightly different because there's a blindness to it, but still in terms of data privacy, in terms of being able to actually monetize your data online, which companies are collecting. I mean, this goes much beyond the world of work, right? Gender-based violence online. So those are still very much at the other end people and offline biases that are then being brought up.
Absolutely.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
And that is the last question.
Unless there's somebody.
I can take 2 or 3 questions together.
Let's let.
Life stories.
Hi, is my audio now working?
Hi, yes. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, Sabina. It was lovely to listen to you, and I would also like to congratulate the iWage team for organizing this session. I hope I'm audible this time. Technology was creating a lot of issues, not letting us communicate at all this time.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for joining, Sakshi. You're audible. It's really nice to have you.
Great. I reconnected. So I really like the emphasis. I enjoyed the talk thoroughly, but I really liked Sabina's emphasis on socio-cultural barriers and the fact that we also need to give more attention to the fact that work for women in the platform economy is embedded in the larger socio-cultural framework. I was thinking of my own fieldwork, which was largely ethnographic in what Sabina called the real economy in the construction sector and garment sector, where women were going out working on the construction sites in several garment factories. I also interacted with a lot of women who had to work from home, who were home-based workers in the garment sector, and who talked about family traditions or care work responsibilities, not letting them go out and work in the factories, whereas men were able to take on better roles as master craftspersons in factories and small manufacturing units. So similarly, I feel, and I went on to look at how many women, especially Muslim women, were able to push boundaries and break stereotypes through their attempts, through their own agency of taking up work outside their homes. And many women home-based workers also transitioning to become thekedars, subcontractors, and expanding their work. So I feel in the platform economy also, it's important that we look at life stories of women who have been able to break stereotypes, who've been able to push their boundaries, who've, and to sort of learn from stories of these women. That would be very important. I completely agree that we need to look at women's work from the lens of empowerment. Is it really leading to women's empowerment? And looking at such life stories or case studies would be important for the platform economy as well.
Thank you for that suggestion, Sakshi. I agree with you. I think that's really important. And there are certain, positive stories. And so I think that's important to highlight and a point really well taken. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Sakshi.
Thank you.
So with this, we actually close today's discussion. Thanks to Sabina so much for actually, having the talk as well as engaging with us. Thanks to all the online audience that we have and to everyone who has made it here, especially those who have come from outside. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We have some snacks if you're all welcome to